share something or particularly talk about something today, feel free to ask.
Hi everyone, I can kick it off if you
Go
like.
for it. Yeah.
Um, I just wanted to ask about interdimensional gates and that north, south, east, west, and there might be a lot more that I don't know about. Um, it's just something that's been, I don't know, bubbling inside me, but at the same time, I'm a little bit cautious of investigating too much because obviously you can get into a bit of trouble, and they're significant kind of things can come in. But do you see them as I was just wondering if you could just share your what you can on them, and that, like, obviously some are locked up because there's bad stuff on the other side, but there's some that are there for good stuff to come through at times, or am I completely off track kind of thing?
Okay. I think really when you're looking at gateways, portals, the portal itself is a neutral thing. It's what it's used for that becomes the issue, and therefore what can come through that gate or what can go through the gate the other way. So gateways are two-way things. When you think of interdimensional, I mean, any gateway into something which is not this physical realm, you could see as an interdimensional thing. So the gateway of the door that Jesus has opened for us to go into the realms of heaven is an interdimensional gateway. Now that is open, the veil is torn, we can access from that realm, and things can come into this realm. Cloud of witnesses, angels can come through those gateways. There are other dimensions. Seemingly in the past, people have tried to open dimensional gateways using ancient knowledge of those ancient pathways because it's there. Adam and Eve had access to the whole of creation, and from the perspective of sonship was supposed to fill that dimension with an outworking of their maturity in sonship. But having chosen to go their own way, their access to that was closed. But the gateways, then they're not closed from the perspective of things can't go through it, but beings are not going to go through it. But that doesn't mean frequency, information, stuff goes through it. So I have been to 3 other dimensional places with a mandate. I mean, I wouldn't have done this without a mandate. And even with a mandate, it took me over a year of, I think, getting ready, but also plucking up courage to sort of go and engage it. And my own fear hindered my engagement in it because I made it difficult by projecting onto the gateway something that really wasn't there. And you can do that. You know, our soul has the ability to project over our spirit, even though it isn't real, but it appears real. So fear, you know, false evidence appearing real, created a gateway that I couldn't go through, or I didn't think I could go through. But in reality, that's not what it actually was. So I was looking at a gateway that looked like a revolving door, you know, like you get on hotels, but with a very thin slit of light that indicated that that was how you get through it. And I looked at this thing revolving, thinking, how can I possibly go through that slit? It doesn't seem possible. But actually, in reality, that was my projection because I really didn't want to do it. And my soul didn't want to go there because there's a memory connected to our spirit of where these things were open to all of us as sons of God when we were spiritual spiritually functioning, if you like, before we came into this dimension. And there is a reconnection that you can have with some of these things that you've been there before. It's not like deja vu, but it's actually, there is a connection. So eventually, when God opened the whole thing for me, I realized that gate or gateway, portal, whatever you want to call it, really wasn't that difficult to go through. But I had to step through it. I could also see through it before I stepped through it, because it was a little bit like a transparent boundary that I could see through, and eventually I stepped through it. And I, fortunately, the Father introduced me to like almost like a staging area, or sort of difficult to describe, but it was like one of the gateways had access to the other gateways, so things could come into there before they came into this realm. So it was a little bit of a sort of what, I don't know what you'd call it, but sort of an ante-room before. And he introduced me to 3-dimensional beings there, and I had a mandate to interact with them, engage, and help them with what they needed. And so, having had that initial experience, then I began to seek, how does this work? And what I found was, having then gone through into one of the dimensions that one of these beings represented, and they were an ambassador on behalf of some of their people who wanted my help, I found that although access in and out of these realms is not automatic, and they cannot enter our realm without some form of permission or opening, things from this realm have influenced that realm. So our following the pathway of the knowledge of the tree of good and evil, the do-it-yourself pathway, has affected those dimensions negatively, in that it appears, and I've only been to 3 of them, that the worst that we have done here is much worse there in a pure sense. So in one of the realms, there was the absolute extreme of a racist dimension that functioned in a keeping a whole segment of society in serfdom and servitude, and really bad, terrible. So much so they couldn't even lift their eyes up to look. Now, I was like, wow, this feels so bad, because I hate racism and I hate any form of discrimination in any way. So, this really was heightened when I went through it. But then I went to all 3 of the dimensions, and to cut a long story short, I found that they were all influenced by aspects of this dimension of man's corruption of God's original intention, and they were there the worst they could be, almost without any limits, because the limitations that we had in this realm with our connection to God, they did not have in that realm. So that was my experience, and I was able to do some things there. Now, then you have, well, okay, if information is going through, is there any evidence that positive information is going through? And actually, yes, because those 3 beings who sought to engage all had sensed sonship. The frequency that we carry as sons is penetrating through those gateways and creating hope for restoration. Because what I found was that although they had followed the original fall of both the covering cherub and man, not all of them, because we're talking about generations, obviously, the present generation have come to the conclusion, I think stirred by the fact that suns are beginning to rise, that they didn't have to follow the same path, that they don't want to follow and make the same decision as following that pathway as their ancestors had done. So they wanted an opportunity of making their own decision, of choosing a different path for them. So I sort of was connecting to that. Now, in 2000, and I think it was 2016, I was engaging with God, and he said to me, he said, there are those who are seeking to open an interdimensional gateway, and they are looking to do that through a wrong way, an illegal way. So I want you to assign sentinel angels to protect the gateway. But then he said, but when the sons of God are mature, they will be able to access through those gateways when the time is right. So I didn't think anything more of it. I did what I was commanded to do, or what I was suggested to do, assigned some angels that I am aware of to protect the gate, and didn't think anything more of it. And then this whole thing blew up over a group of people who set up a website called, openingthewesterngate.org, with a desire to get Christians to give them the permission to open the gate by deceiving them, thinking this was going to be a good thing. Now, that was the conference that was run by Jason Westerfield, highly influenced by a group of people who aren't Christians, but have a desire to deceive and draw Christians into illegal activity. And they were infiltrated a lot of Facebook groups, posting things which they were looking to attract followers who are interested in these things. And a lot of people followed them, but without any sense of discernment. And so this event, Jason Westerfield got a few hundred Christians to agree to open that gate. I mean, because they were, I guess, dazed by gift and charisma and other things, and didn't have the discernment to see what was going on and what was behind it, and they just agreed. Now, fortunately, those angels stopped the gate being open. And then I engaged with several other people who were also given some insight into this gateway. And one of them, a friend of mine, had a dream in which he was walking along with those people on the conference towards the gate, and a angel or an angelic being stopped him and said, you need to see what's going on, and took him up into a gallery to watch. And he saw these people led by a woman come into this gateway and making this incantation, and the gateway opening, and this thing pulling this woman in through the portal. And he said it was the most blood-curdling scream he'd ever heard. And as she was pulled in, she just called out, "You deceiver." Now, I don't know whether that was directed towards what pulled her in or to who decided to open the gate, but now that didn't happen, but that was what would have happened had we not intervened. So having done that, and all this blew up about the stuff, and I got involved a little bit in the process of it, and I was like, okay, God, what are we supposed to do with these gateways? And how are we supposed to legitimately access them or protect them? And then I said, well, what happened the last time these things were opened, if it's been opened before? And he took me back to two events in the past, one in 1947, where two guys. A guy called L. Ron Hubbard, who was the founder of Scientology, and another guy called Jack Parsons, who was a NASA rocket scientist, opened this gate using a ancient, I think Egyptian or Babylonian incantation, and it opened, and that what came through it is what instigated the whole Roswell type abductions and that type of DNA harvesting things that have gone on for the last generation. Previous to that, it was open in 1917, by a very famous occultist. I think it was Edgar Cayce, but don't quote me on that because it might have been one of the other guys. But I think it was a British guy. He used a Babylonian, I think, incantation, ancient knowledge being unveiled, and opened that gateway. Immediately, some beings came through that he named Lam, and he was so frightened that he shut the gate immediately. But the description of those beings and the picture he drew, and you can find it online, very much looked like the pictures of the Greys associated with more recent dimensional incursions, if you like. So, there is a lot of stuff that I think is people are looking to do, and I think some of that's illegitimate. I think there is a way that when we're ready, we can access those gateways correctly to do the right thing, which is demonstrate sonship, to bring restoration to the whole of creation and not just this realm. But I do believe there is some elements to truth to some of the things that happened as a result of those gateways being opened in the past. And we need to make sure that as sons, we function, in our rulership to subdue and to overcome those things. Now, I was talking to someone who, in an engagement with Jason Westerfield, took him out into an engagement with some of these beings, and it absolutely freaked him right out. He wasn't ready for it, and it took months to recover from the experience. So I would encourage you not to pursue something that you don't have a mandate for. If you do feel that you're drawn towards it, then engage God for what mandate you do have in that. I do believe that as we are releasing the sound of our sonship, the frequency, the energy of our sonship, other dimensionals are picking up on it, and they are responding positively to it. Now, when I eventually began to see these gateways for what they were, I found that there were, hundreds of them, not just the 3 that I've engaged, plus the anti-room that I initially went through. So I guess there are people who will be mandated to do some things within those dimensions. But, I think we do have an awful lot to get on with here in this dimension, bringing about the kingdom and establishing heaven on earth and establishing embassies and being gateways of heaven into the earth and ruling in this dimension. But that's not saying that there aren't other things that are open. And, I don't have any inkling at the moment to go back and engage any more of those gateways. I have an experience of it, therefore I can testify to it. So when people ask, I've got some things I can share because I have some experience, but it's not my thing. Part of my role is to experience lots of things which give some insight to bring some sense of validation and open that up for other people to go and fully embrace that. And I don't do it myself, and I've done lots of things which are forerunner experiences, which then someone says, hey, I did this the other day, or I saw this the other day, and I resonate with it. and I can give them some validation to their experience, but I don't get to fulfill all of them. Most of my role is legislative in specific mandates, and I stick to that primarily, unless I get a very clear direction from God to do something outside of that. But they're interesting things, and I understand it is easy to get drawn towards them. And I think with science fiction and films and sort of picking up on some of these, I think the closest to this would be something like Stargate. So there was a series of Stargate movies, films, TV programs, which were interdimensional wormholes that took you to other places. And within that story, there was the story of ascended beings and beings of light. And, I resonated with it at the time without having any real understanding why, other than it being a good show. But now I do realize that there's something more behind that. They also, within that, had the Egyptology and Sumerian type things with pyramids and other things which were from other dimensions from that in that story. And there are others who do believe that there have been incursions in the past that have been effectively designed to engage in DNA. And you could look at the Watcher Angels and the Nephilim pre-flood as an illustration of that, in which they created things or used genetic techniques to enhance things which were not good, and God had to deal with it all. So I do believe there are past examples of that. I'm not totally convinced of it being other little green men and aliens from other planets. For me, it seems dimensional, and that's been my experience. Do they come through star systems? Yes, because that's where the light has been removed in some of those star systems, a third of them, in fact, that were actually had angels who were administrating those star systems, and therefore some of these portals access through some to Sirius and Pleiades and other things. Don't get caught up into the ancient alien stuff of books out there, because they're coming with they enhanced humankind and enhanced our DNA and blah, 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 blah. There was no positive in any of that. It was, we're supposed to enhance them through our sonship in bringing them into a restored sonship position or a matured sonship, not the other way around. That's not to say that they don't have technology or they're operating in things that may be highly advanced, because, as I said, some of them have taken a thread of what's here, and some of the ancient technology, organic technology would existed, and they have majored on that, and their whole society is based on one thread. But hey, there's lots out there, but I would sort of give caution to it. Don't get drawn towards it without a clarity about what God is saying and wanting you to do. Okay. All right. Anyone else got any? Yeah. Anyone got anything more for this realm, or anything else you want to talk about?
Hi, Mike.
Hiya, John.
Hi. Yeah, I'm right. It feels like I'm right in the middle of, seems like God's given me authority in the old church realm, old church system. He's really positioned us right in the middle, and I can really feel God calling his sonship here into that. And I've been doing it practically, like by just the teams I'm leading and just leading them into sonship. And also prophetically, praying each night relationally. And I guess I was just wondering if there's anything else. Like I'm right on the cusp of I'm making a documentary about, I think I discussed with you. It's just coming out now, and it's a directly addressing sonship and orphan spirit. I think it could bring a lot of healing. And we've got our conference next week, the Hillsong conference, and they got Bill Johnson coming for the first time.
Okay.
Which is a big deal around here. You know, that they don't tend to have that stream, you know. So I can see the father heart kind of being revealed. But I guess I just want to really make sure that I can see that it can easily get shut down.
Yeah. I mean, ultimately you've got to sort of, you're in a system which is designed to shut down things that threaten it and threaten how the system works, which is a very hierarchical top-down thing within the religious world. So yeah, you're in a degree, you're in a hostile environment, but looking to demonstrate something of a different spirit. And I think it's like, this is what the Joshua generation is. Joshua and Caleb lived for 40 years with a group of people, primarily who weren't all going to cross, you know, and they looked to engage those within that generation who were going to cross over into their inheritance in sonship, but they worked with them all. And so you could say that was a pretty hostile environment for 40 years as well. And he had to work with Moses, who was the antithesis of what he was going to become. And therefore he lingered in the presence of God in the tent of meeting. And after Moses left, and they developed a different spirit out of the heart of God, which is non-mediatorial and was empowering of the people in sonship. And that's the difference between Moses and Joshua. Moses did it on behalf of the people. Joshua did it with the people, and they did it together. And how Joshua crossed the Red Sea across the Jordan was very different from how Moses crossed the Red Sea. And the same as, you know, dealing with things operated very different. You know, Moses had his hands held up and they won, but when they crossed over and they took Jericho, they basically all marched around with the presence of God in their midst. There was something very old, new about that. And for 40 years, they lived in the knowledge of the new, but in the manifestation of the old. And I guess that would be a little bit like where you are. But they were able to eventually lead the next generation in. And I think that's where, you know, some people, that's their call. You know, for me, that's what I'm legislating for all the time, for the revelation to come of the nature of the love of God, the heart of God, who he is, fatherhood, sonship, that would cause the children of God to come into a mature sonship position in heaven, seated in heavenly places, functioning on the earth, living in dual realms, if you like. Now, for some, there's going to come a point where if the system does not change, then you have to go and take new land. And that's what happened with the Moses generation and the Joshua generation. Ultimately, they basically at some point had to leave the wilderness. And if the systems have developed by building in the wilderness, right, rather than walking around with tents and be ready to move camp, break camp, move camp, break camp all the time, then there is a defensiveness over possession of that mountain, if you like, of authority, which is ruled over, which will deal with the threats in a way, because if their government or rule is threatened, then things can get nasty. So, you know, you're obviously in it. You've obviously got a mandate for it. You know, just be aware and make sure you legislate around your own life, the protection, and only engage those who are responding to the sound of heaven. Don't try and convince people who are not, because you'll just get into arguments, or they will argue with you when those that are beginning to resonate with something new, when you start to share sonship with them, they immediately know in their spirit that this is right. Eventually, you may need to lead those sons out of the wilderness to cross over into something new. That's ultimately, I think, where it's going to go, unless a whole system, and whether you a Pentecostal system or a charismatic system or a Bethel system or a Hillsong system, are willing to totally be transformed to represent heaven on earth. And that means the whole structure needs to change, and they need to be willing to empower everybody to cross over. Then they're going to stay in the wilderness and defend their place, but people will leave ultimately. And it's happening all over the world. And God is giving groups of people opportunity to respond to the call to sonship and the call to cross over beyond the veil and to operate on that side of the veil. And some of them are rejecting that call. And when you reject that, you entrench yourself and become more extreme. And a friend of mine, was invited to go to Morning Star, Rick Joyner's group, and the leaders there invited him to come because they realized that they're stagnating and they're stuck in the 80s and they need more. And so they invited him to come. He was there for a day, taught the people, and the people were embracing it, of a positive future, happy eschatology, that heaven's open for everyone. It's not an elitist group. After a day, the guy was totally shut down publicly from the stage by Rick Joyner, who was totally threatened by the happy eschatology view of things are getting better, because that whole system is prophesying things are getting worse and things are going to end up in doom and gloom. So that was a challenge. And also the issue of this is not just for an elite group, which is what they were teaching. So that was a sad thing. But subsequently to that, I know 2 whole groups have left that movement because they see they're hearing the sound and then they're seeing the opposite being modeled. And, I'm not knocking Rick Joyner, but essentially, once you reject God's offer of embracing something new, you then become entrenched against that, which is what every move of God has happened in the past. It's become denominational and restrictive, and then are threatened by the next move and criticizes it. Pentecostals did it to the charismatics. Brethren did it to the Pentecostals. It's just like it's happened through history. And we need to make sure it doesn't happen again with us. So, yeah, you're in that place. Keep making sure you got the right strategy and let your sound resonate with those who are responding, and don't be concerned about those who aren't. And that's God's business. But I do legislate for people coming into the light, having encounters, sending angels into their dreams with visions. And just because I want more and more people, I don't want people to be, to die in the wilderness. I want everyone to cross over. It's God's desire that they all cross over. But when they're covered by the coverings of men, sometimes it's very difficult for that to be penetrated with truth. And it takes those who are yearning for something, or it takes almost a lightning bolt of heaven to penetrate those coverings and veils to expose the reality there's something new. You may be that lightning bolt. But, be careful, be sensitive, and make sure that you've got a clear strategy of what you're doing, and with those that are resident, and be careful for infiltrators. Be careful that there are those who are saying yes, 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 and actually in their heart it's no, 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 and they could create problems. So, ask for discernment, seek for discernment, look to a heart-to-heart cardiogenosis with people, so you do know their hearts, and you know that which resonates because you've felt the heart of God, and therefore you know those whose hearts aren't really there, at this point, and be careful with that, because they can cause a lot of trouble. You know, but you know, I commend you for for what you're doing, and bless you in it.
Yeah, you're pretty much exactly how it is.
Yeah. Yeah.
Exactly that way. And like 2 days ago, God gave me the most strongest rebuke for one of the people in the church. I don't know what to do with it, but it's very, like, it was the whole, basically said that this is Egypt and we're coming out of Egypt into the desert. So it was like a step before this.
Yeah.
They're under Pharaoh and they're treating people like slaves. And I was just like, whoa, this is so heavy. So it's like, I guess I just need discernment on what to do with that as well.
Yeah, because sometimes God gives you a word for you to do something about it spiritually in the heavens, not necessarily physically with the person. And so knowing where that person is, you can then begin to administrate the love of God to penetrate those veils of darkness that they're under or in, deception, without necessarily having to deliver that face to face, which, but if that's what God wants you to do, then yeah, you got to do it. And I mean, I've had to deliver some things like that, and I've tried to deliver them in the nicest possible way, but it's very difficult to say things when they're not that nice. But you prepare the person's heart, you prepare your own heart as best you possibly can to deliver something like that with love, and that's the key. It's got to be delivered in love. And sometimes God has got to prepare us to have that love to be able to deliver it. Because once you see something, it's very difficult not to unsee it. And therefore you see the reality, and that reality is not a good reality either for that person or the people they're affecting negatively. But I'm sure God will give you the right strategy for what you're supposed to do with it. Rather you than me, I think, when it comes to some of those things. But hey, I've had to do some things like that here. But I found ways of doing it which have brought people along, but some people won't. And when you begin to engage something new, particularly when it's a threat to the systems of comfort of what we're used to, then people don't like it. Over the last year here, we've deconstructed what we do. Church, particularly our gatherings, what we're gathering for, why we're gathering, what we do when we gather, we've deconstructed the whole thing. Well, those who were consumers within that setup and wanted my teaching or the worship and stuff we were doing, they vote with their feet when you stop giving them spoon-fed stuff. When you're saying, hey, we're here to all participate in this, we're not here to be observers. So, God, first thing God did was challenge me speaking publicly here. So he told me not to do it anymore. Now, there were reasons for that. A, because people were getting further and further behind and it was less and less relevant to them. B, we have, sometimes 20 to 30 people who are part of a therapeutic community who some of them have got absolutely no clue about anything. So me talking about some of the things I'm talking about were like, off the grid. And, and C, it was holding me back because I needed to get on and do more than one session a week. So all of those things. But as soon as I stopped doing that, then some people who were there because they liked the teaching stopped. The next thing God did was challenge the worship. So I started to feel bored with it, although it was quite dynamic and, but it was song driven. I felt bored by it all. Why are we singing other people's songs, or even singing some of our own? There's got to be more to it than this, So I felt, and I remember sort of just sharing, not in a nasty way, but and I picked up that there were a number of our musicians who were feeling the same, but the person who wanted the spotlight and wanted the attention of leading the worship and writing the songs and being the front man He wanted to maintain that. And he was not comfortable pursuing, let's say, a more open way of engaging or a more creative way in engaging, and was resistant to freedom in it. So it created a tension. So one Sunday morning, it's like he wasn't there, and a couple of people said, hey, let's try and do something different. And they were struggling a little bit. And I was looking at in the spiritual realm, and I saw a whole group of angels observing what we were doing quite intently. So I'm sort of looking at this. I mean, what are they doing? You know, and I felt, hey, they're looking for something new too. They're bored as well. They want something of a different reality of what we do when we gather and how we engage. So I sort of shared that, and I sort of said, hey, there's a whole lot of angels here looking, and they're looking at us and they're seeing our restrictions. And we've got a couple of guys here who are trying to open up a different realm, and you're just complaining that we're not singing words. And I discerned some of people's hearts. I mean, I knew their thinking. I picked up what they were thinking and saying in the spirit. So I'm saying, hey, help them out. Let's look to break out of our restrictions and comfort zones. And hey, let your spirit start to engage here. And people started to. And then David came. One of the angels I saw went off, and he came back with David, King David. And David came as one of the cloud of witnesses. And I engaged with him. And I said, well, he said, I've been waiting for this day that, you know, you would be willing to step out of the old and start to embrace something new. So I said, okay, great. And he said, here's the key of David. So I mean, I'm not a musician, but I have a little bit of an insight into some of it. And it was just like, oh, okay. And he said, this is to unlock people's inner psalmist. And he said, and that is not so they write songs. That is so they express joy and engage in God in a completely different way. And they're unlocked in their ability to do it. So that was a watershed moment in reality, because I shared it and encouraged people to engage him to unlock, and the musicians themselves. And since that point, you know, we've ended up not doing any singing at all, because people, the musicians particularly, the one who led the whole thing, because he wasn't given the spotlight anymore, you know, sort of left. And those who wanted singing every week left. And so those who are left are those who are wanting to pursue something new and participate, and to bring back a crutch of singing songs without what God intends it to be. I'm not knocking songs. I like singing songs. I like songs. But when you're looking to break out of an old restricted model, then something has to radically change. And then you see where people are on their journey of whether they're willing to really embrace the new things, or whether they're really there out of convenience because it's meeting a need that they have, or they like certain aspects of it. You know, so before we had 25, 30 guys who were in recovery having to fit into singing songs that they had no clue about, and go through a format that was irrelevant to them. And so when I was challenged by it, I felt, okay, why are we using this menu of 5 or 6 things every Sunday? We may change the order, we may focus on one thing more than the others, but actually we're doing the same old that 95% or probably 99% of churches around the world do. Someone will say something, they will usually sing something in one way or another, and they usually take an offering of some sort. That's pretty much, well, we got rid of the offering, you know, we got rid of the way we did messages, and then it was only the thing to be left. And sometimes, depending on what stream you may have some sort of ministry or some sort of engagements or whatever. But pretty much, it's pretty much the same sort of thing. And, you know, God's pretty much bored with it as well, because we've not been willing to move out of that into having an intimacy which is not dependent on externals to engage it. Therefore, we are in this position now where, hey, God, what do you want to do? Let's do that then. And that has no limits or boundaries of, it's going to be a bit of this, a bit of this, a bit of this. We'll change the order, but it's pretty much the same. Actually, we never know what God's going to do until he says. And then when he says, we try and do that. So this week, I'm actually speaking because God said, I have given you a mandate to share this week. I went and shared that with our bench of 7 and said, hey, you know, if you are open, I'm happy to share this week, but I'm not precious about it. I can share any other time if you want. And they were like, okay, yeah, we'll ask God. And they would come back and say, yeah, we feel it'd be great for you to do that. Most of the time, you know, it's become so interactive that the guys on our community love it, because it's not them now watching other people do church. They are integral in it. And therefore we do things that they engage in, they share, they talk, they communicate, they interact with what we're doing. They before didn't want to come, so were forced to come because it was part of their program. Now they love to come because they are actually finding that they are part of it. They're not on the outside looking in. They're integral. And that's changed dramatically because we were willing to say, okay, there are no-go areas here. You do whatever you want, remove whatever you want. Quite often we'll have brunch together, we'll eat together, we'll do things together. It isn't a gathering, it's just people coming together. Doesn't have to have a set formula or format that we've all become used to. It's just people gathering with God in their midst and God inspiring the gathering. It's a challenge though, because people don't like their comfort zones being challenged. And I guarantee huge movements that are based on music, which is the Bethel, Jesus culture, you know, Bethel music, hill songs, they are very focused on the musical side of it. If that gets challenged in any way, they're going to fight kicking and screaming in that. And I'm not saying that there's anything inherently wrong in singing, but there's so much more than it being a performance-based thing or something that just meets our need rather than actually we're there to engage God. You know, about probably 10 years ago now, and more than that, 11 years ago, God said to me one day when I was just observing what was going on spiritually, and he said, you know, do you want to be a church that meets the needs of the people? And I'm like, well, is that wrong? And he said, you know, do you want to be a church that hosts the people of God or the God of the people? So I sort of thought about it and thought, okay, I think it would be better to host the God of the people. And he said, yeah, good answer. Let me deal with the people. But so many systems are designed to facilitate meeting the needs of the people or hosting the people rather than hosting God and what God wants to do. So for years, we assumed that we knew what God wanted to do. And we didn't, because we never really asked him in any real honest way. We may have given lip service to saying, what do you want to do? But we gave him a menu of things he could do and didn't give him free rein. And we come from a very dynamic history of moves of God. You know, we've had 5 or 6 distinct moves of the Spirit, what you'd call here over the last 20 years, in which they've been pretty wild and wacky, you know, and in spite of all that, we were still stuck in a small menu of things which we were happy to be involved in, and not really, although always knowing that I always know there's more, but it's very difficult when people are stuck in entrenched in an old system. So to transition an old model into a new one, although not impossible, because nothing's impossible with God, is very, very difficult. And changing a group mindset and mentality is very difficult. And so, our whole process in that, we've gone back to the drawing board and gone back to a relational perspective of just engaging God and each other relationally, and let's see what he wants to do with that. From a relational foundation, actual true relational building happens. From a structural foundation, you build structures. And most church systems are structures. They may be free or not free, but they're still structures. And we want to build relationship. That is all we need. Everything will come out of relationship. Not much comes out of structure other than restriction, unfortunately. And I'm not saying that we don't do things, but we do them in a relational way rather than a purely structural way and a program-based way or an organizational way. We need to have a fluidity and flexibility about being able to respond with God in the whole journey and process. So, yeah. All right. Anyone else got anything they want to? Oh, Irene, you've got your hand up. Okay, I'll come to you in a minute. Irene's got her hand up there. Okay, anything you want to?
Hi, Mike. Hi, everybody. Sorry, Lily. I just want to give a testimony, going back to what Mike you earlier said, talk about. In fact, I had saw a UFO with my naked eyes in 1980 on the first day of January, which is New Year's Eve. And it was a flying saucer. Because it's very close to me, because I was not the only one that saw that flying saucer together with my mom and my brother. So the flying saucer was, I think, about 70 feet away from me. And my home actually is just facing the sea. So that flying saucer actually was hovering above the sea, maybe 30 feet up above the sea. And then later on, it just flew away very smoothly. And then far away, then we saw another same identical flying saucer. They are sort of meeting each other and then just flew away later on. The color was really interesting because it's light, dark, metallic dark color. And then around it with the fluorescent green lights coming out from like windows, very, very small, tiny windows. So this is something I just wanted to give a testimony about what I've seen. I don't know, because after my conversion, after I born again, I asked many people, and then of course there's no answer about this. So, okay, question is, actually last time I wanted to ask you, Mike, Jason Westerfield, is he still a believer? And then this because I listened to his I listened to him on YouTube long time ago, but of course this day I didn't. But the second question is, in 2001, it was before my conversion, I have an experience that actually a new age woman opened my third eye at that time. And I have a very strange experience after that, that kind of, what she had done to me. And then it scared me a lot. And I don't want to talk about that experience now. But I want to ask you, Mike, do I have to do anything about it? But actually, it was about a year later, I met Jesus. And that is why then I born again, I become a Christian. So two things.
Okay, I mean, a few things in there. I mean, I often look to people like Jason Westerfield who genuinely had an experience of God and other things, and he got deceived. That's the reality. Some of that deception was because of unforgiveness. his unwillingness to deal with Bethel's dealing with him, which may have been harsh. I don't know the details, but I know enough from people that I've talked to. And therefore, when you live in unforgiveness, you end up in a torture chamber. And I believe he therefore was open to the influence of unscrupulous people who took advantage of his gifts for their own ends. And he got drawn into, you know, the Michael Tellinger ancient alien stuff, you know, and he was promoting Michael Tellinger's books, which are old hat. I mean, there's nothing new in it at all. But it's just repackaged by, you know, others. I met him in the following March from that whole conference. He genuinely seemed to be quite a broken guy at the time. Wanted help, but wasn't willing to let go of the whole unforgiveness. I mean, it was just oozing out of him. I mean, unfortunately. And you know, we have no justification to holding on to unforgiveness, no matter what we've had done to us, you know, and that is a dangerous place to be. So, you know, I think there have been stories of him doing some other stuff. I've not seen any of that, so I couldn't say. You know, the guy is, you know, he's still a son of God. You know, no matter, all of us are, the whole world are children of God, irrespective of whether they know it or whether they've got off track on it. God loves him. God wants him to be restored, and we should want the same. So this is that. I also, you know, I've seen, you know, UFO, you know, when I was a teenager, exact very similar thing. Saw it over the sea. It was moving unbelievably quickly, like instantly almost in other places, which I was like, whoa, what is that? You know, so, you know, I've seen some stuff. Again, it was like, didn't have a grid for it. So you just sort of like, oh, okay, did I imagine that or whatever? But, you know I saw it. When it comes to New Age is a wrong name for it. You know, it is discovering ancient age things and repackaging it in a new way to make it more acceptable to modern man and draw them into some of the excesses of it. Some of those people are doing that, and they have more ability and skill and knowledge than most Christians do, because they have practiced functioning in it, but usually in the power of the soul. Not all New Age things are wrong. It's just they've been twisted by those who are doing it out of the soul. So there are counterfeits of what is real. And so there's a lot of energy healing and light and therapy and oils and other things which are very much part of God's inbuilt into creation for health and wholeness that we would benefit from. And there's nothing wrong in that. Aromatherapy and all that stuff. It's who is the practitioner of some of it and what is the motive of their heart behind it you've got to look at. I went to a New Age fair, and I was doing a seminar there, and I went and talked to a lot of the stallholders who were involved in any sort of healing, music healing, sound healing, light healing, all sorts of healing stuff. And I went with discerning eyes to see, is there darkness here? Is there light here? Is there anything here at all? You know, and there were those, you know, who were talking about angels and stuff, and there was no angels there. You know, and there are some things which are just made up. You know, there was nothing there at all. There were a few things which were dark, that felt quite dark in motive, that you felt there's an agenda here which is hidden, and although they can administrate something on the surface looks good, beneath actually it's bringing harm. There's a deposit of darkness that comes with the deception of the light. And there were some that were actually doing good things out of a good motive, using things that God had established. They didn't know God, but they were not doing something bad. So I asked them, those that I discerned were genuine, I just said, look, do you know how you're doing this? You know, what power are you drawing on? How are you drawing on that power? And they just like, I don't know. Most of them were, I don't know, but it works. So I said, look, we have a tent over there in which we have people who can introduce you to the source of the power that you're using for good. You know, and a number of them came and were introduced to the personal presence of God because they were open and because they were genuinely looking to do something good. You know, so the third eye, you know, the pineal gland, you know, there are chemicals which are naturally produced and can be stimulated by light, which create heightened states of awareness that can open up our ability to see into spiritual things. That in itself is not wrong, but it can be dangerous if you don't have a relationship with God in that process of seeing things. Because again, you can see things which so frighten you or have a darkness associated with them that it can cause damage, you know. So I see. Did I learn to see by doing anything with my pineal gland or third eye? No, I didn't. God just taught me to see. Now, is that part of the process of how I'm seeing? Who knows? But I'm not bothered about it because I can see and I can engage. So I'm not really looking for a technique or some sort of thing. I just want to learn and help people to learn to see. So there are those who can open up things, and there are people who will do it in different ways. Some people will use chemicals like LSD, mescaline, mushrooms, things to open up the consciousness and the ability to see things. That can be very dangerous, as people have bad trips when their underlying mental state contributes to what they're seeing, and it can be quite a freaky thing. Not that I've ever done it or would ever do it, but I've talked to people who have. God has met people even in some of those weird things, because God will reach out and reach people. So, you know, I would just sort of say, hey, it may not be a coincidence that a year later you were able to engage Jesus, because God will try and bring good out of every situation that you're in. You know, all things work together for good. So God is working good into even our bad choices and other people's maybe bad intention. So that person may have or may not have had a good intention, but God still used it, and you ended up engaging Jesus and are seeing, you know. So if you feel there's something negative still attached to that, then I would just take it back to God and say, hey, if there's anything here which you want to deal with, I'm open for you to deal with it. Show me and deal with it. You know, that may be, you know, removing a memory. It could be removing the trauma of it, because it feels like it felt quite traumatic. There may still be some trauma associated with seeing, which may be hindering you. Ask God to release that trauma, and so that you can see clearly in that. So I would not sort of be too concerned about it all, unless you really feel God is saying to you that, hey, there's something you need to deal with.
No, it's okay. Thanks very much, Mike. Thank you.
Okay, Lily, you got the floor.
Yeah, I just wanted to say thank you for putting the course together, because 17 years ago, I did a year at Morningstar, and even though I had a great year of experiences, I left feeling like a failure because there was no one there to join the dots for me. And so you'd have a prayer meeting, and someone would go off and get translated in the spirit and come back and share the experiences. And of course, you left feeling a bit stupid because you didn't leave the room. But anyway, so thanks for putting the course together, because it's really helped for me to join the dots and bring the understanding that I needed. Anyway, my question today is about the soul. And we, you know, just a few weeks ago, I've been doing a bit of discussion, and study around the question of hell and the soul, and whether the soul is eternal or not. And we know that with Adam, death came in. So, and then we've got Paul saying, put on immortality. So obviously through the born again experience, we put on immortality. So I'm just trying to touch base on all the scriptures, but I was just reading this the other day, and I just wanted you to shed some light on that, because obviously I know it's the end of the session. But it's in Luke 12 with the parable of the faithful and the evil servant. And at the end, the evil servant says, my master's delaying, and he goes and beats the other servants, and etc. And then the master in verse 46 says, the master of that servant will come on a day when he is not looking for him, and an hour when he is not aware, and will cut him in two and appoint him his portion with the unbelievers. So I'm a little bit stunned, but I've read the scripture a few times. Obviously, we're aware of it, but I'm looking at it closely because of this concept of the spirit and the soul. Obviously, we know the spirit goes back to God, and here we're saying, he'll cut him in two. And if you have shed any light on that, with that, because knowing that my what's thinking in my background is this whole thing about the soul and the eternity of the soul. There you go.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, I do not believe in a pre-existing soul, or a soul that is reincarnated or has come here more than once. I believe that once the physical body forms and the spirit comes out of eternity from the heart of God into the physical body, the soul forms at that point. Now, I know other people teach that it's pre-existent and you have a pre-existent. I believe our spirit is pre-existent, and our spirit has consciousness and memory that you can reconnect to. And I mean, you can rediscover and what you were doing in that sort of spiritual dynamic. The soul and spirit, when they come together in that form, are in some way separated because of the power that the soul has to dominate the spirit without having a revelation of the Holy Spirit's presence. So it's a safeguard. So the soul operates independently of the spirit, but draws life from the spirit and creates soul ties to the spirit, but does not have the personal knowledge of the spirit. Those soul ties eventually have to be broken and reintegrated so soul and spirit could come together as they were intended, because Adam's soul and spirit were synonymous with the relationship he had with God in a very real way. So Adam was not conscious, self-conscious, independently of spirit and Holy Spirit. Adam was not world conscious independently of the spirit, because his spirit was what actually engaged the world and interpreted the world and God to his soul senses. So the soul only drew from the reality that the spirit was revealing. Now, as the spirit then was separated, internalized, he then had his soul engaging with the physical senses to discern the world, hence the knowledge of the tree of good and evil. So the soul in itself is inherently not bad. It's just operated independently of spirit and Holy Spirit, and has created a personality and identity coming out of a lot of the experiences of life. God had imprinted into the soul, which comes from that spiritual identity, redemptive gifts and a sense of personality, which goes beyond just and creativity within the soul, because we're made in the image of God, Father, Son, and Spirit, body, soul, spirit. So there is an innate creativity within us, which we can draw on, because it's actually designed to be the creative aspect of our sonship. But we often use that independently, and therefore it becomes something which validates our independence and our identity from what we do, rather than our identity coming from who we are in relationship with God. And that's the whole process we have to go through of dealing with it. So once we are a living soul or a living being, I do not believe that that soul can die in a sense eternally. So it then becomes an ongoing reality. But it came into a moment in time, but continues ongoingly, designed to be soul and spirit with God in relationship and not independent. So we go through a lot of process to redefine that. So immortality is, but for me, is having spirit and soul and body come into God's original intention of working together in harmony and wholeness and oneness with him in relationship. It's not just about the length of life or not dying. It's the quality of living in the eternal now, today, in the moment, mindful of eternity all the time, centered around that relationship with God. Now, when you get scriptures that, that you read, those scriptures are talking to a particular group of people about a particular circumstance, which was the day in which the old covenant was going to come to a final end. So where it talks about outer darkness, where it talks about being separated into two, it's not talking about physical death. It's not talking about spiritual death. It's talking about covenantal death, because the covenant had to be split in two. If you remember the covenant that God made with Abraham, Abraham went into a deep sleep, and God cut the animal in two and walked through, in the figure of 8, the covenant sign, through the midst, in the blood in the middle. So when he was talking about being cut in two, he was really talking about, you are going to be outside of the old covenant if you continue to walk in the old covenantal ways rather than being in the new covenant. So it wasn't it, because it's symbolic language, which relates back to the curses of the covenant, which you gotta, if you don't understand the context of that, then we read it and try and figure it out using our understanding, which is maybe completely outside of that. So when it talks about sending people into outer darkness, it's not to do with hell or any concept of that. It's to do with outside of the covenant. And when it was saying you are going to end up in Gehenna, the fires of Gehenna, bottom line is that was the literal rubbish dump outside of Jerusalem, the Valley of Hinnom, which has associated with child sacrifice and bad things, which they turned into a rubbish dump. They literally ended up there. It wasn't talking about some future estate for the soul. It was the physical place they were going to go. Then once they went there and died, their spirit went back to God, and their soul went to the place where it would engage the fire of God's presence for an ongoing process of being purified and refined to come back into the new covenant by accepting Jesus as Lord, because he was the only way into the new covenant. And they had not accepted Jesus as Lord. In fact, they rejected Jesus as Lord, which is why they were outside of the new covenant. And in that period of 40 years after Jesus went back into the realms of heaven, there was 40 years where there was this transition from old fading away to finally ending, which is what Jesus taught in Matthew 24. This is the end of the old and the birth pangs of the new. And finally, the old system and every stone of the old temple, which was known as the heavens and the earth, the heavens and the earth were removed, and the new heavens and the earth, which is the new wineskin of us being the temple and God dwelling in his people, all mankind, because now the Spirit is poured out on all flesh. That was really what it was all talking about. So it's a very, very different view how you interpret those scriptures. And they understood them. Most people today don't, because we're trying to understand them through 2,000 years of wrong thinking, rather than the cultural context that they understood. That's why they wailed and gnashed their teeth, because they were outside of the covenant. And when Stephen in Acts challenged them in terms of the covenant and Jesus, they gnashed their teeth in frustration. It's nothing to do with eternal torment. It's just the language is not understood from an old covenant perspective. So if you look at gnashing of teeth right throughout the Old Testament, you'll find it's nothing to do with eternal torment at all, but to do with frustration and anger and resistance often. But, so yeah, I believe that the soul continues after death. It's not annihilated. It continues in the fire of God's presence, which we all have to go through one way or another, because he is a consuming fire, and that death is not the end of choice. And you can't find anywhere in the Bible that says that death is the end of choice. And I personally have gone into the fire. Jesus has taken me there to show me what he did, because he went into the grave, into Sheol, and led captivity captive, and preached to the spirits who were imprisoned there. And he basically told us to do everything he did. So when he took me there and showed me how to do that, I was like, I'm not sure I'm really up for this. It's just like, this is going to cause me no end of trouble, I'm sure. And he said, well, if people got a problem, you just tell them, hey, I did this and I told you to do what I did and greater. So take it up with me, which is what I've done, and people have a problem with it. Hey, that's no problem. But I have experience of leading hundreds of thousands of people out of the fire in my generational lines, having preached the good news to them. And that's where their souls are. If they don't know.
Still a lot to process and sort of where to hang it in my little, not trying anywhere to put it all, but I hear what you're saying, and I take it on board. Just my last sort of angle to that question is with unbelievers who die, they choose to reject Christ, they go to the deathbed and they don't want to, repent. Now, because we're Christians, we don't go through the punishment because we've got Jesus' blood. How do they pay for their sins?
Jesus paid for their sins.
But they haven't received that.
But he still paid for them. There's double jeopardy. You don't try someone twice. Jesus took our death, because the wages of sin was death. Jesus took our death. There is no death. That's why the soul will not die, because Jesus has already taken the death. He brought resurrection life. There is no punishment. See, the word punishment is a wrong translation of the word kalasis, which comes from the root of pruning or chastisement or correction. The addition to punishment is a modern addition, which you'll find in Strong's Concordance, as properly it means this, but commonly it means this. And they always tag on through an evangelical perspective of what they think punishment means, or the word kalasis means as punishment. There is no punishment. Now, that doesn't mean there isn't consequences. Jesus took the death. If he reconciled, look, 2 Corinthians 5:19 said, God was in Christ, so they were not separated at the cross, they were together, reconciling the whole cosmos to himself, not counting their trespasses against them or sins against them. So he's already reconciled everybody, and he's not counting any of the things that they have done or that they have through lost identity, because sin is actually lost identity. That's what it is.
Okay.
So they do not have to pay the penalty of something that Jesus already took. So God didn't punish Jesus. Man punished Jesus. There is no punishment that God was going to bring on anybody, but there is consequence. So when people go Jesus visits every single person on their deathbed. And many respond to him at that point when the light comes to them, and they respond to the light. Usually those that have not rejected him while they were alive, consciously. But there were some who consciously rejected him while they were alive because they wanted to do their own thing. They were doing DIY religion their own way, and they consciously rejected. And they often consciously reject him at death. So they go into a state where they go into the presence of God, not knowing his love, having consciously rejected him, and they're now aware that they're not just going to not exist, because that's what a lot of people think. They just won't exist. And now they're aware that they're actually conscious and they are existing after physical death. So that creates an anguish of soul, which is like their soul is tormenting themselves through their own choices because they realize that they're there. And some of them are self-righteously stubborn enough to continue resisting the love of God. Now, I have been in the fire of God's presence numerous times, knowing his love. And even so, it was quite an intense experience of fire, consuming fire, transformation in that. If I was to go through that, the judgment seat, facing the judgment seat, my scroll purified with fire, without knowing the love of God, there will be an intense thing I would not want anyone to go through. And so the consequences are there in that they face what they've done, not knowing they're forgiven, even though they are. So can you imagine replaying everything that you've ever thought, done, in a negative, which has contributed to you being in this position from your own mindset of guilt, shame, and condemnation, because that's what they're feeling, without knowing love and forgiveness? It is an intensely bad place to be, but God wants them to come out of that place and discover that they are forgiven already, because they are. They just don't know it. As a man thinks in his heart, so is he. So most people are living separated from God because they think they're separated from God, and God is not ever separated from any of them. Because we're all in him. You know, in him we live and move and exist. So how can we be separated with him? That place which I call the fire of God's love, consuming fire of God's love, is within him. You know, there is no separation from him in the way in which we've taught, because that's a whole mindset which is coming out of a wrong understanding of judgment, justice, and not understanding that mercy has triumphed over man's judgment and man's own concepts. So in essence, people can choose, and Jesus has gone there and he has preached to some of them, and he wants us to be involved in that process too. And I've seen hundreds of thousands respond when you preach the right message. And one message is not always the right message for everybody. That's my personal experience. You don't have to believe that. It's no problem. You can believe whatever you want to believe, but ask God. Go back to God and ask him. You know, ask him to show you, take you there, to show you what's going on. It's not an easy. It is. I'm not a universalist that believes that everyone will get to God in heaven without having to go through that process. No roads lead to God other than Jesus. He is the only way. But I do believe that God will engage people on every road to get them to find the right path, which is Jesus. Jesus is the only way to the Father. But God's desire is that everyone would come to a knowledge of the truth. That's what it says. He also desires that everyone would come into a knowledge of forgiveness. So he's at work in everyone in this realm within to unveil the reality that they're already forgiven and that they're already reconciled, and they just need a realization of it. We've taught people evangelically that God is outside of them trying to get into them, and they can only get into them when they do this prayer or do this altar call or do this thing. On the resurrection day, everyone subsequently is alive Everyone has been born again or born from above. Their spirit is alive and is able to engage, but their soul is disconnected and God is at work. So when Paul had his Damascus Road experience, and he described it in Galatians 1:16, he said that God was pleased to reveal Christ in him. Not in the light. The light just brought him to the point where God was able to reveal Christ in him, not outside of him, in him. So all have already been included in what Christ has done on the cross. All are already included in Christ, and Christ is already in everybody, looking to reveal himself so they can come to the knowledge of it.
Mm-hmm.
We've taught totally the opposite. And we've contradicted actually what Paul's gospel was all about. And unfortunately, people do not understand that a lot of what Paul wrote in letters was actually quoting letters that were written to him and refuting them. So they just read what's written on face value. Oh, Paul must have meant this. Paul must have meant that. Paul was quoting the letter that someone wrote to him, and he was saying, no, I don't agree with that at all. I'm going to totally undermine that argument now with this truth. People don't realize that. So they read the Bible and get so confused because they don't have the spirit of truth, and they're not engaging the living word. They're trying to get it all from the written word. And that's where people get confused. Jesus didn't promise us a book. He promised us the spirit. Let's embrace the spirit of truth. Everything that we have a concern over, take back to the spirit of truth, the way, the truth, the life, and the Father, and discuss it with him. And be open for whatever he might show you, because that will be a challenge, no doubt. All this stuff was a challenge to me. But now I have categorical first-hand testimony, which no one is going to shake. I don't mind if people believe something different. Everyone's entitled to their own beliefs. I'm not going to argue with people over it. But I know that I know that I know, because I've been there and done it and seen other people, and I've talked to other people who've done it as well. So I'm not just on my own in this. There's lots of people that are doing this today because they're wanting to see their generational lines restored, and they're wanting to see a restoration of the heritage that is designed from their generational line. But, you know, it does say that every knee will bow and every tongue will confess that Jesus is Lord, to the glory of the Father. Now, it's difficult to reconcile that scripture with they're going to be forced to do it, when it says that no one can confess Jesus is Lord but by the Spirit. So I don't believe this is everyone will acknowledge it because the demons have to acknowledge it. This is everyone will acknowledge it because God is never going to give up on them. His love will never fail. We cannot escape his presence. David said, I go down to Sheol, you're there. It's like God's presence is not, you can't escape his presence. So we just go into his presence in a different way. Those that know him go into his presence in an intimate way. And for those of us who are living in his presence in those realms now, that's just an ongoing development of that. And those who don't know him go into his presence, which feels like fire. It's not literal fire. God is not a literal fire. It's a description of what fire does. And fire transforms and purifies, because that's what the word means. The word for fire in Greek was pur, purification, purify, purge. You know, all those come from the root of fire. And the root of punishment is correction, and the root of torment is testing, because the word for torment is the word brazeo, which comes from the touchstone, which was testing the quality of metal. The whole evangelical movement has twisted all of those words to turn the God into an eternal tormentor who's going to punish people forever. And he isn't. And it's not who he is. And we've got to undermine that view of him to the world if they're going to turn to a loving God and not be afraid of an angry God who needs appeasement. And that's the system that most of us have been brought up in. Certainly I was. There we go.
Yeah, thank you. A lot of food for thought.
Yeah, there's some food for thought there. Okay, I need to leave it there. I've got